Naturalist John Muir, founder of the Sierra Club, close friend of Teddy Roosevelt, and instrumental in creating the U.S. National Park Service, and truly articulating the conservation philosophy that led to the creation of national parks, forests, and reserves around the world. Well, he was a prolific writer as well. In one diary entry, just written just before he went into a several weeks long expedition into what would become the Sequoia National Park, wrote, "Into the forest I go to lose my mind and find my soul." It's a famous quote among many who call themselves outdoorsy because it turns so easily into a meme. It can be found on stickers, mugs, posters, and is omnipresent in Facebook groups dedicated to hiking advice. I think one of the reasons it has become so famous, besides its pithiness, is because so many have found true spiritual growth while out in the forest. In our digital world, there is something that feels real about the wilderness. I think it's no secret that I love being outdoors. Most of my cherished memories from childhood take place outdoors, and I find that holds true as an adult. I've come to know that when I'm feeling stressed or overwhelmed, a brisk walk outside will almost always clear my mind. A skill set and passion that I've developed since moving to Edmonton is backcountry camping. While the woods of northeastern Pennsylvania feel like home, their wildness pales in comparison to the forested settings just an hour even outside of Edmonton. When hiking and camping in the backcountry of this northwestern part of the continent, sure, it is good advice to be prepared, like the Boy Scouts say, but more importantly, it's essential to keep a clear mind, to let the anxieties and pressures of life and living pause for a moment, and to be focused instead on the present moment. If you are not paying attention in the wilderness, it could be easy to make a crippling misstep, to lose your trail, or to encounter wildlife that doesn't want you around. Such presence of mind is a spiritual discipline that rings true of hikers, whether they consider themselves religious or not. This, I believe, is the essence of John Muir's quote. We do not go into the wilderness to leave behind our worries. No, we go into the wilderness to find presence of mind and a deeply human experience of being tested in that which feels eternal. This scriptural story of Jesus in the wilderness, it's timeless. I believe that it echoes older biblical stories like Adam and Eve leaving the garden and finding a new way forward, as well as the Israelites who wandered in the wilderness for 40 years, learning about themselves in powerful ways on their journey. Likewise, I think Jesus' own wandering in the wilderness points forward. It's a passage known to many, both inside the church and by people who have never set foot inside a Christian community. As we read the passage, perhaps we fixate on the temptation of Jesus by the devil. But I don't really think that's the point. I think the tempter's presence in the wilderness with Jesus functions as a literary device. We might start thinking that Jesus is a bit off if the scripture tells us that he's talking to himself. So instead, he speaks to this tempter, this presence of thought that creates a foil for himself. Instead, what speaks to me about this passage is that Jesus needed to go off for some alone time, something that he has been prone to do throughout the Gospels when things become overwhelming. Instead, the wilderness is a contemplative practice in and of itself, a place of communion with God. In Matthew's Gospel, the wilderness is a transition story between Jesus' birth and his adolescence, but prior to his traveling ministry. In Matthew, Jesus' experience in the wilderness immediately precedes his most famous and beautiful teachings, the Sermon on the Mount, which contained the Beatitudes and some of his most famous parables. The wilderness is a place of learning and renewal, a place of personal growth, and Jesus' departures from the crowds later in Matthew's Gospel echo Jesus' time away. Was it in the wilderness that Jesus made peace with his fate? Was it in the wilderness that Jesus gained the courage to care for people in open defiance of their predatory state? Was it in the wilderness that Jesus' own faith in God turned from that of a child filled with rules and customs to a holistic, relational, spirit-led way of living? Recently, I had some conversation with Adeline, our musician, about Mary Poppins. Before the Disney movie, Mary Poppins was a protagonist in a series of books, a nanny, of course, who cares for children and endowed with special gifts, a special insight into human nature that makes her so effective. Adeline shared with me a quote from the book Mary Poppins Comes Back, which features a dialogue between one of Mary's charges, Annabelle Banks, to a newborn bluebird. You see, the bird was curious about where it came from, and the child had this intuitive sense, which she shared. She said, "I am earth and air and fire and water. I come from the dark where all things have their beginning. I come from the sea and its tides. I come from the sky and its stars. I come from the sun and its brightness. And I come from the forests of the earth. Slowly I moved at first, always sleeping and dreaming. I remembered all I had been, and I thought of all I shall be. And when I had dreamed my dream, I awoke and came swiftly. I heard the stars singing as I came, and I felt warm wings about me. I passed the beasts of the jungle and came through the dark, deep waters. It was a long journey." I find this to be powerful poetry about our origins. In our modern, digital, virtual streaming world, it can become easy to feel lost in the midst of our houses, sidewalks, and Zoom meetings. We long for human connection, to feel human. And I know that many of us have learned more deeply a meaning of life in the midst of this cultural wilderness experience known as the pandemic. This quote from Mary Poppins that roots our origins into the eternal, what might appear to be chaos, well, it identifies the source of the divine within us. Just as Jesus and later John Muir found clarity in the wilderness, I hope that we too can find clarity in this pandemic wilderness. Many backcountry hikes, especially in the mountains, start at road level and then ascend to a high place. That's the challenging part. The return trip with a lighter pack, the challenge completed, are often afterthoughts with good endorphins flowing. In terms of this pandemic, it certainly feels like we're on that descending trail with our eyes fixed on the trail exit. But I hope that we will be able to remember the clarity we may have found over these months, and thank God for it. I hope that we will be able to set off ministering and loving in new, more bold ways, just as Jesus did, because of our experience and our remembrance of where we came from.